In this video, the final fourth part of this series, I'll finish discussing my favorite orchestral moments for timpani and bass drum. Recall that I ended the third part with a passage from Gustav Mahler's Fourth Symphony, in which the timpanist actually plays one of the principal motifs of that movement, consisting of 3 pitches. As timpani parts over the decades continued to grow in complexity, composers increasingly used timpani as melodic instruments, assigning them the actual thematic material. Another example of this by a different Gustav, Gustav Holst, is the Jupiter movement from his orchestral suite, The Planets. The movement begins with this effervescent violin accompaniment that introduces the first theme played by the horns and lower strings. Zooming in, notice the scoring for 6 timpani tuned to every pitch of the C major scale except F, and that the violin accompaniment, divided into 4 parts, consists entirely of this repeating 3-note motif, played out of phase with the duple meter and mostly out of phase with itself in the other parts. When the blue theme repeats, notice that now it's doubled by the timpani, playing this entire portion note for note. I highlighted this new horn figure with the same green color from the opening because shortly after, this rhythm is combined with the intervals of that opening 3-note motif to create this new theme. And shortly after that, this figure, now played by the trumpets, also appears out of phase with the duple meter to introduce this new Mixolydian dance theme in triple meter, first played by the horns. This new theme now repeats 5 more times, whipping itself into a frenzy by getting louder, faster, and more complex with each repeat. This is a common phenomenon in the traditional dance music of many cultures, and a similar but even greater example of this from orchestral music of this same decade is the finale of Stravinsky's Firebird that does the same thing with this initially slow and quiet Russian folk tune, first appearing as one of the most breathtaking horn solos in any orchestral music. I'll discuss the rest of this incredible finale in a future video, but returning to Holst, when this 8-bar theme repeats the first time, the timpani return, just doubling the downbeats of the bass line, but drop out in the second repeat that instead features the tambourine. The timpani return for the third repeat, again just doubling the bass line, but now this is combined with the green figure played by the trumpet and woodwinds. The fourth repeat now adds a third layer of complexity by bringing back a variant of the opening blue theme played by the trombones. All of this continues in the final 5th repeat, with the timpani returning not just to double the simple bass line, but to play the entire purple theme, even including the fast triplets at the end. can't discuss the passage we just heard without pointing out the similarity between these repeating green figures, especially when played by the piccolo, and this. Though of course it's not exactly the same intervals. Finally, jumping to the middle of this movement, let's listen to the famous Andante Maestoso theme, also highlighted in green because it begins with that same initial three-note motif. I'm including this section in this video because at the end the timpani again enter, now doubling most of this much more involved bass line. Moving on to more examples of actual thematic material being scored for timpani, let's jump forward a few decades to some of my favorite timpani passages from Shostakovich, starting with the tense, neurotic third movement of his 8th symphony that begins with this marcatissimo viola figure. After 4 alarming sforzato chords from the lower strings, we find out that this viola figure is really the accompaniment, almost like a walking bass line, when the actual theme now enters, comprised of these disturbing, shrieking woodwind figures, accentuated at the end of their crescendos by these single staccato trumpet notes. Later, the intensity increases as the lower woodwinds and lower brass now play the green figure, and the trumpets play the purple figure, accentuated now by the horns and timpani. I've often wondered whether these parallel trumpet triads might have inspired John Williams to compose this theme only 3 decades later. And speaking of John Williams, I recently discovered this rare historic footage of him composing this Star Wars soundtrack. to Shostakovich, after a humorous middle section, the opening material returns, but with a brilliant orchestration change that makes it somehow even more disturbing. The violins now play the purple figure with a mute but fortissimo, and with a glissando down to the final note that is plucked by the left hand, and now accentuated by a single xylophone note. A long crescendo consisting of the green figure and the alarming gray sforzato chords builds to the final terrifying climax of the movement, and the moment of interest for this video, when the timpani suddenly start playing the green figure, also muted but fortissimo like the violins from before, giving it a similarly sinister tone quality, while the entire orchestra now plays the shrieking purple figures, building to this final quadruple sforzato chord. This triple forte snare drum roll now introduces the equally intense opening of the Passacaglia fourth movement. Shostakovich ended his 10th symphony, my personal favorite, with a similarly explosive timpani passage, in which they hammer out the DSCH motif, a musical cryptogram that appears in many of his compositions, meant to represent his own name, much like Bach had done with his BACH motif. Remember that in German, B means B flat, and H means B natural, so the BACH motif sounds like this. As you can see, Shostakovich really had to stretch this concept to come up with his motif, using the German S for E flat. Some of you may remember my own 2018 composition based on the BACH motif, but stay tuned for my much more personal future canon based on the Chad as motif. Back to Shostakovich's 10th symphony, the DSCH motif first appears in its third movement as part of this dance-like woodwind theme. The motif pervades the rest of this movement, but is absent at first from the final fourth movement, that instead begins with two of the only cheerful, carefree ideas in the symphony. First, this one. And shortly thereafter, this one. I'm highlighting them both orange mainly because both have lots of 16th notes. Eventually, we hear this more foreboding theme played quietly by the bassoon and lower strings, and notice that it's just a simplified variant of that first orange theme. This new dark blue variant is now played in close imitation as tension continues to build. The intensity continues to grow with the brass playing the dark blue theme fortissimo, but now using the octatonic scale that alternates between half steps and whole steps. This octatonic scale was also popular in the music of many Russian composers that preceded Shostakovich, and is sometimes called the Rimsky-Korsakov scale, but it's almost a hallmark of Shostakovich's music, and the DSCH motif fits so well into so many of his compositions because the motif itself is part of an octatonic scale. Now listen to slightly more of this intense section. If you know this symphony already, you probably recognize this material from the even more frenetic and violent second movement. Back to the fourth movement, this violent material returning from the second movement culminates in this triple forte DSCH motif, played by the whole orchestra with the timpani entering on its final note. This is the first time we hear the DSCH motif in the fourth movement, and it's hard not to read into this moment when the motif vanquishes the violent material from the second movement, some sort of personal triumph over strife, whether or not you believe the controversial story in which Shostakovich revealed that the violent second movement was a musical representation of his recently deceased arch-nemesis, Joseph Stalin. By the way, these photos are from my recent trip to the country of Georgia, birthplace of the famous dictator, and as you can see, there was a lot more Stalin-enthusiasm than I was expecting. Returning to the finale of Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, the DSCH motif continues to interact with the other thematic material for the remainder of the symphony, leading to a nearly equally intense, though now more optimistic, coda section, in which the motif is played at 3 different speeds, first quarter notes, then eighth notes, and then half notes like the initial entry we just heard, with the same timpani roll on its final note. The timpani then, for the first time, play the entire motif, doubling the other bass instruments, and in one final outburst, the timpani alone hammer out the motif multiple times, first as quarter notes and then as eighth notes, before the symphony ends triumphantly in E major, with one final entry of that second orange motif. Moving on, let's return backward a few decades to one of the greatest composers for timpani, Carl Nielsen. I've already discussed many of his best timpani moments in this prior video, including, of course, the famous battle between two timpanists from the finale of his Fourth Symphony entitled The Inextinguishable. Watch that prior video for a better discussion of the thematic material and form of that movement, but in this video I'll just focus on my favorite timpani moments throughout this symphony. Notice that the immediately intense opening of the first movement already includes this prominent first timpani passage, tuned at the tritone, and that the score directs the two sets of timpani to be positioned opposite one another. In the 3 or 4 live performances of this symphony I've attended, and in this photo, I've noticed that nobody seems to pay as much attention to this second directive, to place the timpani close to the audience, though I suppose how close is open to interpretation. My favorite timpani moment from this first movement, near its end, is when they participate in a crescendo to this menacing outburst. Shortly after this is my favorite single bar for timpani, or I guess I should say my favorite quarter of a bar, when these 3 loud outbursts from the orchestra are answered by the lone first timpanist to introduce this triumphant trombone and tuba entrance. The enigmatic opening of the third movement again features the timpanist doubling the chromatic pizzicato bass line of the lower strings, while the violins play the melody. In this opening section, of which I'll only play a portion, the timpanist plays 11 of the 12 possible chromatic semitones, a feat, pun intended, that requires the tuning pedal, invented about 4 decades earlier, as I mentioned in the last video. The 2 opposing timpanists are of course the main attraction in the final movement, and again, please watch this prior video of mine for a better introduction to this finale. Their first big moment includes instructions that the timpani from here on, even if playing softly, should maintain a certain threatening character. This first passage has each timpanist playing a different tritone, with the second timpanist imitating many of the gestures of the first timpanist a bar later. In fact, as I unbelievably neglected to mention in my old video, large portions of the timpani duets in this movement are strictly canonic, in this first case at the interval of a major third. After participating in a crescendo to this intense poco pesante section, the timpani drop out for a few bars before having another big moment, tuned again in tritones separated by a major third, but now just transposed down a half step from before. The final menacing timpani battle, and remember that this symphony was finished in 1916, during the height of the First World War, a possible inspiration for this passage, begins with the quiet rumblings of both timpanists, doubling the foreboding B pedal tone of the contrabassoon. This crescendos to the explosive showdown, in which the timpani are now tuned to sixths, again with canonic imitation at the interval of a third. This eruption of violence culminates in these upward glissandos from both timpanists, again requiring the pedal, doubling the upward chromatic scales from the woodwinds. Now listen to this entire famous timpani battle. Watch my prior video to hear how this conflict resolves triumphantly to end the symphony. But for this video, let's skip right to the final crescendo, since it features a prominent solo for the second timpanist, while the first timpanist is playing this sustained role. Since I've been ignoring the bass drum so far in this video, let's jump to the finale of Nielsen's much neglected 6th Symphony, completed in 1924 and entitled Sinfonia Semplice, or Simple Symphony. This finale is a set of variations on this humorous theme first presented as an unaccompanied bassoon solo. In that prior Nielsen video, I discussed the hilarious waltz in the 6th and 7th variations that eventually features the bass drum in these wildly chaotic Ivesian interruptions. For this video, let's concentrate on the equally comical 9th variation, in which the bass drum actually has a starring role. Notice the already amusing orchestration of only bass drum, bassoons, tuba, xylophone, triangle, and snare drum. Fragments of the theme are distributed among these instruments, often recognizable only by their rhythms. For example, this portion from the beginning of the theme played mainly as a bass drum solo. The xylophone enters mostly with this next portion of the original theme, that consists of upward fourths, and the tuba enters mostly with the final falling triad of the original theme. After this first page, the snare drum and triangle replace the bass drum for the rhythm-only fragments, and at the very end, the bassoons finally appear to take over that tuba fragment, so the tuba itself can end the variation with this final flatulent shenanigan. Believe it or not, this is actually a real photo of Carl Nielsen, from this actual photo shoot from his teenage years. As an ardent proponent of Nielsen's music, I'm ever grateful that he lived before the age of social media, since I fear he might have become an Instagram model or one of those annoying prank streamers instead of a top-tier composer. Luckily for us, we now get to listen to this prank variation. Moving on, I think it's only fitting to end this video series with one of the greatest pieces for timpani and bass drum, and probably most other instruments too, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, composed in 1913, one of the most famous and justifiably revered pieces in the entire orchestral literature. For this video, I gave myself the impossible task of choosing just 4 of my favorite timpani and bass drum moments from this masterpiece, and I intend for this to be a preview of my eventual much more thorough deep dive that I've been teasing in prior videos. Since the music of this ballet is meant to portray a series of ancient pagan rituals and dances, including at the end a human sacrifice, it makes sense for the drums to play such an important role, to evoke images of a ritualistic drum circle in a primitive village. The drums are also critical in emphasizing the rhythmic unpredictability for which the Rite of Spring is famous, and they play a starring role in the most wildly ferocious moments of the piece. Let's start with one of these, the terrifying opening of the Glorification of the Chosen One dance that I already mentioned in the first video of this series, a moment so iconic and shocking that Disney chose it only 27 years later to accompany the scary Tyrannosaurus Rex scene in the animated film Fantasia, though of course the actual subject matter of choosing a young maiden for the eventual deadly ritual is perhaps even more frightening. A menacing crescendo, including the tam-tam, builds to this infamous bar with an 11/4 time signature, in which 4 differently tuned timpani and the bass drum team up with the strings to play 11 dissonant polychords. This introduces the wild first page, consisting of these upward shrieks from the flutes and piccolo, answered by these downward snarls heard mostly from the horns, and this bar of pas, with the being played by the bass drum and lower strings, and the pas being played by everyone else. Rhythmic and metric unpredictability are on full display on this first page, following that bar of 11 from the last page with 2 bars of 5/8, then the pa bar of 9/8, that feels like it has an extra at the end, since the downbeat of the next 5/8 bar is also an So this whole first page sounds a little something like this. Now listen to how this all actually sounds. After this first page, listen for these confusing 7/8 bars that begin with an unexpected extra oompa, and also try to notice how Stravinsky exploits the very different sounds of the timpani and bass drum, especially when played loudly. The timpani have a much more in-your-face explosive sound, but notice when the bass drum plays these 3 triple forte notes that it just sounds deeper, scarier, and more earth-shattering than if the timpani had played them. Also listen for one of the many drum circle moments I mentioned earlier, when the timpani repeat these groups of 4, even though the time signature is still 5/4. You'll know it's coming because it's immediately preceded by my favorite trumpet outburst that I'll highlight orange. I'll mostly save for the future video my discussion of the final sacrificial dance, the most rhythmically difficult and complex section of the piece, during which the chosen one dances herself to death. But no collection of great timpani moments could possibly exclude this maniacal passage that also includes bass drum and tam-tam. Now let's jump backward to the ritual of abduction that also includes prominent timpani and bass drum parts. Listen for this figure played by timpani tuned a major seventh apart, followed by this similar but faster figure played by the horns. At the end of this section, these frenetic flurries from the strings are interrupted by explosive chords from the whole orchestra, including timpani, but then, in this single bar, the bass drum suddenly appears to replace the expected timpani and whole orchestra with this unaccompanied single-note solo, followed by the expected timpani and orchestra chord. Believe it or not, this single bar is what originally inspired this entire video series, since it's such a perfect demonstration of the sound of the bass drum followed immediately by the sound of the timpani. Now listen to this whole section. I decided to end this video series with the frenzied Dance of the Earth that concludes part 1 of the Rite of Spring. This is preceded by The Kiss of the Earth, an eerie moment of stasis involving timpani and this suspenseful dissonant string chord, before the prestissimo dance begins in the most dramatic way possible, with this crescendoing bass drum solo, nearly overpowered in the next bar by this tam-tam crescendo. The timpani now create a 4-against-3 polyrhythm with the bass drum that will persist until the final few bars of the dance. Again, we hear rhythmically unpredictable loud chords from the whole orchestra, interspersed with additional deafening tam-tam crescendos. After the subito piano we just heard, the remainder of the dance is one giant crescendo that adds layer upon layer, becoming increasingly feverish and energetic. First, listen for these upward whole-tone scales played by the bass clarinets, fragments of which we've already been hearing, doubled by a 16th note cello version that matches the rhythm of the timpani. The rhythm of the bass drum is matched by the horns playing fragments of a theme that will become much more prominent later in the piece. Smaller fragments of which we also just heard, doubled by the violas. Because all of this continues for the remainder of the dance, I won't highlight any of it after this first page, instead focusing on these much more audible trumpet entries that sound like those double-tonguing exercises brass players are always doing. Always answered by these whirling dervish figures from the violins. The frenzy comes to a head at rehearsal 78, when the timpani and bass drum suddenly switch to a 3-against-2 polyrhythm at the same moment that the tubas enter for the first time in the whole dance, adding some extra heft to these upward whole-tone scales, while the loud, unpredictable chords from the opening now return. These scales and chords continue during the final 4 bars of this immense crescendo, but now the timpani and bass drum again alter their rhythm, with the timpani playing 8th notes and the bass drum just hammering out 12 final crescendoing quarter notes that in some performances can be the main thing we hear. I hope you've all enjoyed this mostly chronological survey of my favorite timpani and bass drum moments, and I'll now conclude the series by playing the frantically intense Dance of the Earth in its entirety.